Welcome back to the Monday Morning Point Guard podcast. On today's episode, going to be talking about Russell Westbrook and his fit with the Lakers. It seems like things are trending in a really negative direction as far as that relationship and just in general his career. So will this ultimately be his last stop? Are we witnessing the last few years of Russell Westbrook's career? And what can he kind of do to prevent that from being the case? If you did enjoy the video, please be sure to like it as well as subscribe for weekly content. Also, the podcasts are now up on Spotify, so you can listen to the full episode uninterrupted there. And if there's a spot you agree with, disagree with, either reach out to us on Twitter or in that comment section, and we'd love to discuss with you. My God, I'm sick of talking about the Lakers. It seems like we can't go 2 weeks with them without some crazy story breaking about them. It's like a car wreck or something this year. You just can't help but look at it. You can't stop and look away. It's just, it's too much with them this year. And obviously the season has just been a total disaster. And the writing was kind of all over the wall here preseason with how this team would struggle. And I wasn't one of those who saw the team struggling to this degree. I knew the Russell Westbrook and LeBron fit would not be ideal, and at some point that was going to matter. I thought it would be really late into the playoffs, and even for those who didn't believe in this group as a title contending team right off the bat preseason, I don't think they foresaw this being a below 500 team. Anytime you've got LeBron James, Anthony Davis, and Russell Westbrook, you would expect them to be at least solid, even if the fit isn't the best and the surrounding pieces aren't the best. It's just crazy with how much they've struggled. And this week, we've had a couple of stories break about the team scapegoat, Russell Westbrook. And while he hasn't been good this year, this isn't all his fault. I talked about earlier in the year that Anthony Davis deserved much more of the blame for what's happening here when they traded for him and when LeBron kind of pushed the Lakers to make a move for Davis. I feel like the intention there was to eventually have him take up the mantle, take the torch from LeBron and become the best player. And it seemed like earlier on that things were kind of trending in that direction. We saw him really dominate in the bubble, mainly on the defensive end, but he was also really effective on offense. And it seemed like he was kind of taking that next step into becoming the generational type player he has all the talent to be. And then even last year, he tried to really push through and play through an injury in the playoffs, ended up going really poorly, but it just kind of felt like something was different with him. And we were going to start to see him really capitalize on that generational type potential he had. And then obviously Russell Westbrook, just not a great fit. And just in general, what is with this, with the LeBron big threes? The third banana in these groups always gets blamed when the team doesn't perform. In Miami, it was always Bosh. It was always Bosh's fault. In Cleveland, his second go around, it was always Kevin Love's fault. And now with the Lakers, I hesitate to really call them a big three, but I think it's kind of structured that way, at least salary wise, and kind of the way that those three dominate the ball. Russell Westbrook is getting the bulk of the blame here. And in fairness of him, even if he was in his prime, I kind of mentioned he struggled this year, but even if he was in his prime, this is a weird fit. Doesn't make a ton of sense. And before the season, I kind of figured the Lakers would try to stagger LeBron and Russ's minutes. I thought if AD really stepped up into kind of the main focal point of this team, LeBron would just play less minutes during the regular season and kind of coast. And then Russell Westbrook and Anthony Davis could kind of carry the team. Obviously, Davis has been hurt much of the year, but even when he's been out there, it's been kind of meh at best. And I just really thought that they would stagger the minutes between these two as much as possible. But Vogel really hasn't done that this year. And all of their struggles and not staggering the minutes and it's not fitting, not working, all of that has kind of led to this two stories that came out this week about Russell Westbrook, and they're a direct result of that. First of all, Frank Vogel is receiving internal pressure to move Russell Westbrook to the bench. This has LeBron's name written all over it. Who else would this internal pressure be coming from? Or what else would that possibly mean? I feel like the rest of the coaching staff is likely to have Frank Vogel's back. Rob Pelinka really hasn't said much this year at all. He's just kind of been in the shadows. I guess it could have been him, but I don't know if that's actually the case. And then if Jeannie Buss wanted Russell Westbrook benched, he would be benched. I have a feeling if the owner came down and said, hey, Frank, we really need you to bench Russell Westbrook, that would be that. And so that kind of just leaves LeBron out there. And then the second story that came out is just that the situation between the Lakers and Russell Westbrook has just completely eroded. It would be impossible for them to coexist next season, according to Mark Stein. I jokingly kind of mentioned this a couple weeks ago with the Lakers trade deadline kind of wish list, that their best bet was to make Russell Westbrook so miserable that he declines his player option. It seems like the Lakers, interestingly enough, might be trying to do that. I still think ultimately, though, it's not likely that he's going to turn down a nearly $50 million option to play next year, even if it means sitting out sort of like John Wall has this year. And so what can the Lakers do? The Russell Westbrook market at the offseason isn't going to be drastically different than the one they had at the trade deadline. So you're pretty much left with a John Wall swap that's going to have to include a first round pick. Now, whether that be a swap or that 2027 first altogether, that could be kind of negotiated on, but it's still going to take more going out than coming in when it comes to a John Wall trade. And then I guess you could hope that the Knicks are really desperate, that things really go poorly here in the back half of the year for them, and they give you the Burks, Fournier, and company deal where they're just throwing all their pieces in to add up to the Russell Westbrook salary. And that's kind of the whole point of the video, or the podcast in this case. Could this be the last Russell Westbrook stop? Could this be kind of the end of his career? Should we be trying to enjoy what little time we have left with him as a player? History certainly isn't on his side for this. It's not uncommon for small guards and guards of his size to fall off a cliff completely after they turn 30, particularly with the ones that really rely on their athletic abilities like Russell Westbrook. He's 33 right now, and he's going to be 34 very early on into next season. So even if you're optimistic about him having a bounce back year or there being a real market for him in the offseason, whether it be this offseason or the following one, depending on what he does with his option, he doesn't have long left. He just doesn't. And there is some historical precedence here. So let's try to get into that and see what we can expect here going forward. So there's a couple of players that kind of stuck out to me. I started going through the list of like kind of score first athletic type guards who are around the Russell Westbrook size and seeing what happened in their career. Baron Davis was a guy that kind of came to me at first. He was a guard he was really athletic. He was a score first guy. Both of these guys are really similar in size. Davis was a better shooter, but he wasn't as athletic as Russell Westbrook. He plays a few games with the Knicks at age 32, but he's basically done in the league at age 31. Steve Francis, same height and weight as Russell Westbrook, essentially. He plays a couple of games at age 30, but again, basically over at 29. Gilbert Arenas, a little taller, skinnier than Russ, but they're relatively the same size. And like Francis, he plays a couple of games at age 30, but it's basically done at 29. Monte Ellis, one of my all-time favorites. And while he wasn't a point guard, he's a similar size and a similar player in terms of shooting efficiency. His last pretty good year was at 29, and it was completely done by age 31. And I hear what you're saying with those names. A few of those guys had some injuries, and in the case of Gilbert Arenas, there was some questionable off the court stuff, to put it mildly, but and also none of them were the level of player that Russell Westbrook is or was. And so I get that, but it's still not trending in the right direction for Russ, and it still doesn't bode well when it's hard to find an example of an athletic guard who's really extended their career much past 30. And I think there's a better example of a player who's had a very similar career and who went on a similar trajectory of what it appears Russ is on, and that's Allen Iverson. Size-wise, Russell Westbrook is much bigger, but both are inefficient shooters who relied on their athletic ability to get to the cup, and both are former one-time MVPs. Iverson, a 43% field goal percentage for a career, and 32% on threes. Russell Westbrook, 44%, so slightly better, but only 30% on threes. Very similar between those two. As I mentioned, both of them won MVPs, carrying seemingly a team by themselves. both not really true point guards, but also not really shooting guards. They were dudes who could fill it up scoring wise, but weren't really geared as much to the playmaking and improving teammates. Also, neither were really great defenders. I think Iverson is remembered as a better defender than he actually was. And I expect that Russell Westbrook is likely going to be the same after 10 years after he's retired. I think people are going to remember him as a really good defender, but it just isn't the case. For Iverson, his last really special year, like peak of his powers year, came at age 30, where he was still averaging 33 a game. He was still really good up until about 32, but then after that, it was a pretty steep drop off in production. Russell Westbrook's last great year was at 31, and then it's been a pretty steep drop off production wise, at least scoring wise, ever since then, triple doubles aside. Iverson, as I mentioned, he was a former MVP, and his pride would just not allow him to take a diminished role as his skills and his dominance diminished. And that's what ultimately pushed him out of the league. And with the second story that came about the Lakers fit and kind of Russell Westbrook feeling that it's going to be impossible for them to move forward, part of that story and that article that I read stated that he's been really defiant, Russell Westbrook, and when he's been approached by people within the team, be it teammates or coaching staff, asking him to change his role or his approach. He's just been really defiant and not really wanting to hear that. The way both of these guys have played over their careers, Iverson's obviously in the past tense, just the work it took for them to get where they are, that's ultimately what makes it so they feel like they can't allow themselves to take a back seat, and they have a blind spot. They're not able to see the regression that's kind of taking place throughout their career, and they still feel like they're the same player that they've always been. It doesn't help that these are two system type players. And what do I mean by that? Well, to use a football example, think about Michael Vick, Lamar Jackson, even Tim Tebow to a lesser extent. If one of those guys are your quarterback, then you have to play a certain way. They have to have the offense catered to them and built around them and built for them. And while that's great when they're at the peak of their powers, it looks really good when they're at their best. As they age, you still have to play that way, and it just doesn't look as good. And that's what leads guys like that to kind of be, at least quarterback-wise, be done before you would really expect. You would never see like a Lamar Jackson or something playing until he's 45, like Tom Brady. And Iverson and Russell Westbrook are the same way. If you had Iverson early on, he's going to dominate the ball and take a lot of shots, take a lot of inefficient shots. He's not going to set up teammates, and he's going to be picked on defense. And so it really comes as no surprise when you think about that the best Iverson year as far as team success, he was really the solo guy on offense, and he was just surrounded by great defensive players and guys who didn't need the ball, like Dikembe Mutombo and Eric Snow. Russell Westbrook plays very similar to that. And while the assist numbers are a lot better than AI's, it's not exactly like he's orchestrating the offense like a Chris Paul or a Steve Nash. Like Iverson, he's taking and making a lot of bad shots and dominating the ball. And for the assist piece, it's really only coming off the back of him kind of dribbling the air out of the ball for the whole possession and passing to an open teammate as the shot clock is expiring. And that's where he's getting a lot of the assists. He, like Allen Iverson, needs a lot of guys around him who don't want or don't need the ball, guys who can shoot and space the floor for his drives. The ball dominance is ultimately what drove Kevin Durant out the door, and we never really saw a great team centered around Russell Westbrook after those years with Durant. Both of these guys wore out their welcome quickly with other stars who were brought in to either help them, or in the case of both Iverson and Russell Westbrook, sometimes they were moved on to a different team to pair with another star. Iverson ran through guys like Stackhouse early on. He was really good. Chris Webber, Carmelo Anthony, Russell Westbrook, obviously Kevin Durant, Paul George, James Harden, and now we're seeing it with Anthony Davis and LeBron. The way they play just doesn't allow for them to coexist with other great offensive players. It's why that Allen Iverson finals team was just him and a bunch of defensive guys, essentially. It's why we have never really seen Russell Westbrook carry a team deep into the playoffs as the main guy. So what could this look like for Russell Westbrook moving forward? Moving past the history of the league, let's just say that Russell Westbrook declines the player option this offseason and enters the free agent pool as an unrestricted free agent. What NBA team is signing up for this current version of Russell Westbrook? A guy who's not going to take a diminished role, not going to take a back seat. He wants to be the main ball handler, and I would say at the very least the number 2 guy on offense, but he's probably wanting to be the first option offensively. He's a player who's a liability at this stage on defense. He can't shoot. He turns the ball over a lot. Also, how much money is he wanting? Just for the sake of this argument, let's say that any team that wants Russell Westbrook could come to terms financially with him. I'm not sure that that would be the case. We'll say that everyone has enough salary cap and they can agree on a deal. Let's just go down the line and see what teams fit-wise might be interested in taking on a guy like him. Well, none of the rebuilding teams are going to want him. They're not going to want him to stump the growth of their young guys. Russell Westbrook, throughout his career, he's been terrible playing with young players. He just overshadows them and kind of dominates them out of the game plan completely. It's a little bit like planting like a small sapling as far as a tree goes next to like something like a giant redwood. The sapling just isn't going to get enough sun and nutrients to grow, and that's the same thing with Russell Westbrook. So let's go down the standings. Let's start out west. Well, the Suns, Grizzlies, and Warriors, they're pretty happy with their point guard situation. Very little chance that they're wanting to add Russell Westbrook, and especially a Russell Westbrook who wants to start and be a main piece of the offense. The Jazz, they like to shoot threes a lot, and that doesn't really bode well for Russell Westbrook. And they already have Jordan Clarkson as this inefficient shooting guy. And I would say that they're pretty happy with Mike Conley as the starting point guard. So very unlikely that they would be interested. The Nuggets are happy with Jamal Murray. They're not going to move in that direction. Maybe the Timberwolves would want to move off D'Angelo Russell and bring in Russell Westbrook, but it's doubtful that they're going to want anyone in the way ball dominance wise of Anthony Edwards. The Clippers, maybe, but we've already seen his fit with Paul George. And aren't we just doing the Lakers big 3 thing all over again? Except now there are 3 guys who want to dribble the ball instead of just 2 with LeBron and Russ. So I don't think that the Clippers would likely want to do that. I think the Pelicans have learned their lesson from putting non-shooters around Zion. And they likely don't want to take any touches away from Zion and Ingram. And now you can throw CJ McCollum into that. He's been really good here to start things out for the Pelicans. That's just a lot of mouths to feed, those 3 guys. And if you're adding a 4th in Russell Westbrook, I just don't think that would work. The Spurs, Rockets, Thunder, they're all rebuilding. Maybe the Blazers are desperate to pair another star with Damian Lillard, but with the emergence of Simons and Dame already in the backcourt, that's a tough fit. I think you're probably wanting to start Simons as opposed to bring him off the bench. And if we're assuming that Russell Westbrook wants to be a starter, that really doesn't work. The Kings are desperate enough, but I think they've learned their lesson with crowding the backcourt based on the Halliburton trade. I don't think they would trade Halliburton and one at the deadline and then in the offseason add Russell Westbrook when they're wanting to see what they have with Davion Mitchell and have enough room for De'Aaron Fox to operate. Out east now, that's all the teams in the West. The Heat won't want to add another non-shooter with Jimmy and Bam. And also we have Lowry there, so there's no chance of them adding him. No chance Daryl Morey wants to bring back Russ. Russ doesn't get along with Embiid and probably doesn't get along with Harden. I don't know that for a fact. I know he doesn't get along with Embiid very well. I think the Bucks are really happy with their starting 5. I mean, they won the title last year. I doubt they're looking to add Russell Westbrook as a starting point guard. I think he would kind of get in the way of what Giannis wants to do a lot of times, and that wouldn't be great. The Bulls have a really crowded backcourt. Lonzo is the perfect guy for them starting at point guard, especially with guys like Levine and DeRozan who want to isolate and score. I don't think adding Russell Westbrook in place of Lonzo as the starting point guard would do them any favors. Quite the opposite. I think Brad Stevens with the Celtics is smart enough to see that Russell Westbrook isn't a fit for them. They already have enough your turn, my turn stuff between Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. The Cavs have Darius Garland, first-time All-Star this year. He looks to be like he's going to be really special. They also just traded for Karis LeVert as his backcourt mate. And they still have a decision to make with Colin Sexton. They aren't completely sold on Sexton since he is a small guard and a high volume shooter. It starts to sound a lot like Russell Westbrook. So I don't know why they would want to just get an older version of that. The Raptors, still a really young team. They have Fred VanVleet, and they're sort of rebuilding. So I think it's unlikely that they would want him. KD, likely not signing back up for the Russell Westbrook thing. And I can't imagine a worse fit between two players in the NBA than Ben Simmons and Russell Westbrook. The Hornets and Hawks, they're both really happy with their young ball dominant guards. The Wizards, they've been there, done that, but maybe they want to run it back with Russ. And I think the Knicks are a solid maybe. They might see this as too on brand for them, picking up an aging star, but they do need some life kind of breathed back into the team here, and that might be the way to do it. The last three teams, Pacers, Pistons, Magic, all rebuilding and all have young guards that they're happy with. So that leaves really just the Knicks and maybe the Wizards as teams that might sign up for this ball dominant version of Russ, but I think it's maybe at best with the Knicks and probably not for the Wizards. I think most of the other teams are a firm hell no. So that kind of gets me to both of the articles put together here. So the best case scenario for the Lakers is Russell Westbrook coming off the bench. But I think that the Russell Westbrook side of this, what he wants to do with his career, I think ultimately this is a best case scenario for him, even more so than the Lakers, is him coming off the bench. I don't think it really is going to change the Lakers' destiny at all, which is why I say this is more of a benefit for Russ than the Lakers. I think it might help a little bit, but Vogel could get more creative with the rotation stuff, and you could stagger LeBron and Russ enough throughout the game that it might work there a little bit better. Obviously, if Westbrook is still expecting to play crunch time, that's going to be a problem, but I think just shifting the rotation around would help a little. And as I mentioned, with the kind of career path Russell Westbrook is on, it's very similar to Iverson. And look what happened to one of his teammates, Carmelo Anthony. Melo was just completely out of the league because no one thought that he would take a back seat, come off the bench. It didn't appear that he saw himself as not as good of a player as he was in his prime. It still seemed like he felt like he was in his prime. And so teams stayed away. He was just completely out of the league. And then once he kind of accepted, hey, I'll come off the bench, I just want to be back in the league, that was when he was able to find his way to the Trailblazers and now ultimately to the Lakers. So if Russell Westbrook agreed to do the same thing, I think a lot more teams would be interested in him. If he comes off the bench and gives you 20 minutes a game of Russell Westbrook, I think that's a good thing. And or if he just wanted to give you a possession here and there of the ball dominant player that we've seen, and he just seemed in general more willing to move the ball on possessions where he wasn't doing that, I think he could have a resurgence to his career similar to Derrick Rose and the one we've seen from him. He should really sit down and talk with Melo while he has the chance, while they're on the same team, and look at the Derrick Rose situation in Minnesota and now ultimately in New York for a template of like what he could be and what he could bring to a team. If I was a GM and I could bring Russell Westbrook in as like a sixth man, seventh man, just a guy to carry the second unit, and I didn't have to worry about playing him down the stretch of a game, I would be really interested in that. I'd be really interested in adding that to my team. But he's going to have to prove that to the league. He has to prove that he's changed. He has to prove that he's willing to be the mentor, be a great teammate, a guy who's willing to do whatever it takes to win, even if that means less shots and less minutes. If he comes off the bench for the Lakers, people are going to say, wow, look how selfless Russ is. He's agreed to come off the bench for this crappy Lakers team. Imagine what he could do coming off the bench for us. I hope that's the route it goes, but at some point he just is what he is as a player.